So Kathy, why don't you just come on up and tell us what you've been doing in Kenya.
Paul had a slot to fill here. And plus, I was I was in training to get my certificate of trauma studies. So I went as, this was part of the certificate program, a 120-hour internship. So I had to raise, like the students, raise support for this. So some of you were very gracious in helping with that support. So this is kind of my thank you to you and my report of that. And we went with, I'm actually an associate professor at Regent University, but as part of my continuing education that I have to do every year, I did this certificate for trauma studies, and that includes also about 100 hours of classwork in PTSD and compassion fatigue and psychological first aid, counseling children, adolescents, and family during trauma, grief, and loss. So a whole year's worth of going down every month for like weekend training. So the people on the team were myself, some other professors, and some mostly masters and doctoral students. So that's our team leaving Dulles Airport. And when that's a very historical, on the right there, a picture of the airport in Kenya, which has burned down since since we were there. And they've hopefully, I don't know what condition, but that's the international arrival area that did have about 2 weeks after we left. There was a big fire there. We took an 11-hour flight to Dubai initially and had a 5-hour layover in that airport, and then about another 5-hour flight to Nairobi, and arrived about 8 o'clock p.m. in Nairobi. And stayed, this is on the left here, our director of the trauma studies, the guy with the beard, is Ben Keyes, Dr. Ben Keyes, and his colleague, another professor at Regent, Dr. Merrill Reese, and he's like the co-director of trauma studies. And this is on the right, a Christian inn where we stayed that first night, because we arrived at 8 o'clock at night in Nairobi, and it's not really safe to travel late at night, because we were about a 2-hour drive from Nairobi up into the mountains. So we stayed there, and it was a very pleasant place, except it was right next door to the biggest mosque in Kenya. And this was during Ramadan, and they had the loudspeakers going till about 11 o'clock at night for prayer, which was an interesting experience. And so we arrived at our destination that morning, the 21st, we stayed at the orphanage called Into Abba's Arms. And there are about 40 children that live there with a staff that's a very stable staff, a very loving environment. That's the downstairs is where the little children stay. There's another wing, another building where the teenagers are. We were on the top level. That's kind of their guest quarters. They have a lot of people cycling in and out doing mission and volunteer work. And that's where we hung up our clothes. And
I'm going to turn these lights back on.
Okay.
That's better.
It's better off. On or off? Can we do half and half?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I guess that's asking too much. And you can see from my jacket, it's July in Kenya, and it was cold. It's their coldest month, especially, when you're in Nairobi, it was somewhat pleasant in the 60s, but up there it was like pretty much in the 40s, 50s, and very cloudy. That was their winter, their rainy season, and it was cold up there. You saw the top level of that building. This is inside of that. You can see it very well. And that's where we had, every night we had debriefings where we talked about what happened during the day. And that's when we also met that first day. We broke into the 13 of us students broke into 4 teams with the team leaders. And so one team went out to the internally displaced persons camp, which we did later. Another team went out to the community. We stayed in the complex here in the orphanage because we talked to we did some training with the staff at the orphanage into Abba's Arms, because one reason we were asked to come back specifically, the team had gone there last year, and in the intervening month, the idea was, we were going to go to South Sudan in the summer, but that got nixed because of political issues. And then the people from Kenya said, we'd like you to come back. For one reason is it was a break-in, a very serious break-in at the orphanage, where the staff were actually tied up, and the thieves knew exactly where to go for the valuables, like computers and other things. So the idea was that it had to be sort of an inside job, because they knew exactly where to go, and nobody was hurt, but they were very traumatized. And they wanted to and since then there's been a lot of distrust among the staff. And they wanted us to do some team building and deal with issues of trust and integrity building. So that's what we did here. And so Dr. Keyes talked about integrity, we talked about trust, then we broke into groups. There were about 7 people on the staff that were there during the break-in, so he had them in a group, and then I had other people in a group that had just heard about, they were off that night, or they had been new since, and so we separated the groups because they each had different stories to tell in terms of their experience, and talked about role models in their own life and how they try to live, lives of integrity and biblical ideas. And so that's what we did that first afternoon. The lady on the left there, that's Christina. Christine is sort of she's the director of Into Abba's Arms in Kenya. The lady on the right, with the white hair, her name is Donna. She is the director from the U.S., and she's from Texas. That's where Into Abba's Arms is headquartered. She's like 6 months in Kenya and 6 months back in Texas, so she kind of goes back and forth. And the gal in the middle is April. She's one of our staff members. So the setup was that each day we went to a different location, or people came to us to give these presentations dealing on different areas of trauma that they asked us to talk about. They meaning, you see the man next to Ben. He's one of a pastor interpreter. We had 6 pastors who acted as interpreters, and so they communicated with us prior to us going in terms of the kind of issues that they felt the people were facing. Also because we had been there, not me, but the group had been there the year before. They'd gone to various secondary schools and gotten information back in terms of what they would like more of. So we did get a lot of communication over the year in terms of the kind of information, the kind of groups, the kind of issues that they were struggling with and would like some help with. So we were invited back by schools, by Abba's Arms, by community groups, and so we went back. They went back to those groups that they had been at last year, and were requested to do some follow-up training and discussion. This is just some of the kids at the Into Abba's Arms. These children are not adoptable. They're orphans, but they want to provide a very stable, loving environment where there's a lot of cohesion. They want to be a family. And they very much the staff there has been long-term. There's not a lot of turnover. They provide excellent care for these children, and the children are quite secure. And while we were there, the little 3-year-old girl was introduced to it. They come from some of those very, very desolate slums. What's the name of that big slum in Nairobi? Kibera, yeah, Kibera. The thing is with what we learned was that if a mother, for instance, is put into jail for drugs or prostitution, if she's in jail for more than a year, her parental rights are severed completely. She cannot have those children back. And so that's why there's a lot of children in these orphanages, and they want to make sure that they're safe. So during holidays, these children go back to families for holidays, but they know where their home is, even though some of them have family elsewhere. Yeah, Howard.
Is it significant that Abba is Aramaic for father? It's the word that Jesus uses on the cross.
Daddy.
So it's addressing the father in a position, I think, of great tension and chaos. Is that correct?
What's that?
It's a word used in Aramaic when Jesus is addressing his father on the cross.
Right.
Okay. I just said so.
Yeah, but also, but when the disciples asked Jesus, how should we pray? He said, our Abba, right? So it's, when he was in anguish, but as well as you to come to your father as daddy. It's a term.
Sometimes it's translated.
It's both, right? So, yeah. So I think it's the Jewish word for father. Like when there's a lot. We live in a very Jewish community, and on the playground you hear children all the time saying Abba, Abba, or Ima, Ima. So they just, that's just the traditional everyday word for daddy. That we hear it all the time. Yeah.
I don't think Christ used Abba on the cross. I thought he said Eloi,
Eloi,
Sabachthani.
Uh-oh.
I'll fix that.
I told him to come back in 4 hours.
Yeah.
He didn't listen to me. Okay, so there, you notice all the little kids have these hats on. Girls or boys are all shaved. When they go to high school, they can grow their hair. So I think and it's not just true for. I don't know if it's true for. I think it's true, kind of all. It helps with the cleanliness, the light. Getting 40 kids out in the morning. You're not going to be full with hair and barrettes and braids, and everybody does it. So that's what They don't think that's anything unusual about that. And they go all the way through its time to go to high school. Through it, 2 or 3. They even had babies until about 18. Okay, this is one of our first. Our team, our first group was to this Abba's Arms itself, and this is we went to a town called Githunguri, and 2 teams went there. One team, I said down, so it was a 2-level building. One level was for the police, and our group spoke to community health workers. And we primarily in the morning spoke about alcoholism, because outside of Nairobi, it's interesting. I don't know. This is my first time in Kenya. Maybe some of you have been there. That the Nairobi is a big modern city. Has all kinds of services for any city would have. You go outside. You go just a little bit further out. There's nothing. All the services you need are in there. And if you are out in the country, there's really nothing, and there's no rehabs. The pastors are primarily the pastors do a lot of community work, but they have these community health workers that go from town to town, and they do education. And they knew very little about the disease model of alcoholism. They just basically told people, don't drink. It's bad for you. And the pastors especially were very, very judgmental of people who drink, and they just called them drunkards. You're not to be in our church. They were just shunned. And they didn't understand that there is this progressive disease addiction model that, we taught about the physiological and psychological cycle of addiction and disease. And one of the big problems, not only is there, alcoholism as we know it, but the big problem is that there's a lot of tribal areas, and the tribal chiefs get a lot of their income from these homemade brews that are lethal. I mean, it takes 2 drinks and you're practically in a coma, and it's highly addictive. And as a result, these you talk about men, in anguish, fathers, they are just incapacitated. They're not working, and so it's this whole cycle of poverty and abuse because of the out of work, don't have any money. They're impoverished. They drink too much. The alcohol they use is very highly addictive and highly lethal. And so what to do with that? So there was a lot of talk about, it's kind of blame shifting. It's the government's problem. They need to shut down these tribal things. It's the church's responsibility. They need to be more of an active force. It's the family's problem. So getting sort of some agreement that, hey, we're dealing with a very complex issue, but there is a solution. Try to bring hope into the situation. Talking about like an AA kind of model. Help, getting people that have recovered to lead groups or lead, one-on-one counseling with people that are in the beginning stages. Saying, this is a process that at some point can be stopped and turned around if there's interest and if there's education about this.
What about turning it around with respect to the money? You said there's money to be made. Who makes it and what do they do with it?
The tribal chiefs make it, and it's we got the impression there was just a lot of corruption that goes, the police and the other, they were just disappointed with the amount of graft and corruption. It doesn't trickle down, that's for sure. And later we talked to women who were saying, the bunch of women got together to buy a cow so they could sell milk so their children could get uniforms so they can go to school. And then the husband comes home, he sells the cow, and he buys this drink, and then he's angry and beats the wife because she yells at him about all she ever talks to me is about money. All she ever wants is money. Well, she's just trying to keep the family together, but he's just feeling like everybody's against me, so he goes off to the bar with his friends.
So is it legal to sell this?
Yes.
Brews? It is. It's not illegal.
Well, right now it's sort of quasi-legal. That's why the corruption. People kind of don't really pay attention to it. And there's no rules about children buying out. There's no legal age to buy alcohol. So they send their children out. The fathers send their children out to buy the stuff to bring it home. So,
Kathy, the community health workers that we see here, who employs them to go from village to village?
I don't know a lot of that detail. I'm assuming it's government. I think they're the government employees. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship there. They want to solve the problem, but not all that much. That's why they're frustrated that they send us out to do this work, but they're not really helping. They're not really giving us the tools that we need. But they were. So these presentations. That's one of our students giving the presentation. We would give a presentation for about an hour, and then we'd have like hour-and-a-half groups where they really talked about addiction in their own lives, addiction in their families, in the community, kind of the problem. Then we'd give another hour talk, and then we'd have another group about talking about various solutions. And we just facilitated the discussion. They were really happy to talk about their own lives and about problems. So we learned a lot. We learned a whole lot more than we taught. But I think it was helpful for them to be in a group that they've never had that opportunity to share among themselves. So they got a lot, hopefully from the talk, but probably more from kind of collaborating with one another.
Kathy, in these families back in the bush, I assume that's right. How much exposure do they have to modern media?
I don't think a whole lot. A
Could
lot of
this
them don't
be-
have
Could
any,
that be related to the...
a lot of them don't have electricity.
Could this be related to the fact that they're very willing and open to talk about everything, because that's the only kind of communication
Yeah.
they have?
Yeah.
So would it be accurate to say maybe in the United States, might want to look at cutting back
Oh,
on a
yeah,
lot
oh,
of
yeah,
communication?
we learned some, every time we would get together for our debriefing at night, we'd be a little, kind of a little traumatized ourselves. That's why we had the debriefing about some of these stories. But on the other hand, it says, in spite of the problems, and we have our problems, there was just a sense of loving their families. In spite of this, loving, their community. Let me show you this next picture. Every break that we had, you take a break after, you have your talk, then you have your group, and then you have tea, and you come back from tea, and before, if we were doing a conference in the U.S., okay, we've had our break, okay, now let's do our talk. Oh, no, they do like 20 minutes of praise. This is a secular group, right? They're praising God, they're praising Jesus, they're singing, and it's like, I said, gee, this could go on for a long time, but they know how to, they know and 10 minutes later, it stops. And it's like, wow. And that happened about 3 or 4 times during the day. And at break time, there was just this dancing, singing, praising, sincere. It was great. Merrill here, he talked a lot about grief and loss and compassion fatigue to the police.
You're going to talk more about human trafficking
Yeah.
which is on the card.
Yeah. That came up in several talks. So, here I'm doing a little talk there too, and that's the group picture. I'll talk about that when we talk about the community. Okay, this is that building that that we're in the upstairs up there, and I just looked out the window, and that's the city. That's the outside the window. So this is this was a good 50-minute drive from where we were in the orphanage to get to this place. So it's kind of halfway between Kinangop, where our orphanage was, and Nairobi. So it's sort of a suburb of Nairobi, and that's a typical city street. Yeah. Just outside the bus window. Now the next day, again, it's another 45-minute trip that our team went to the internally displaced persons camp. It's not a refugee camp, it's an IDP, internally displaced persons, and this is the kind of the side effects of their, mostly over the last 20 years, of election violence, with the conflicting, the Kikuyu and the different tribes that fought each other after the elections. This camp, they had about 6 camps, and this is the all the other camps have been taken away, and the people have been given land. This is the last remaining one. I think there were about 1,500 people in this camp, in tiny, tiny, tiny little huts with wood-burning stoves inside of the hut, and they use it to keep warm and cook their food. This is the tribal chief, who got his permission to go and talk to people, and he was very gracious in letting us do that. You can kind of see the camp is kind of set in the back. It used to be, it's been in this location for 8 years. Prior to that, it was 13 years or so. No, it's been here for 12 years. Prior to that, it was 8 years this was about a good quarter to half mile off the main road. It was located by the main road, but because of, it was a political embarrassment when other foreign people were to come, dignitaries, and they didn't want people to see this mess. So their solution was to move it back a half a mile. This is a national forest. This was all wooded. And Ben, who was there last year, he said that even last year, this camp was really set back in the trees. Now all the trees are gone, because that is their only source of income, is fuel and income. They chop wood, they put it on their backs, they put it on bicycles, they go out to the main road, and they try to sell it to people coming. And they're just cutting all the trees down.
Real quick, what's the camp I'm trying to understand? So these are, if there's a political clash, and these are the...
Well, we talked, for instance, these are the people that were on the wrong side of the election. We talked to this one family, and he said, he was an older man, what insulted him, about in his 70s, and he had worked for the British, when the Brits were in charge, colonized Kenya. He worked in the country club, and he was so proud of himself. He reached in his wallet and he brought out an ID card and showed us. He was a maintenance man at the country club. And then he said that he retired. They bought a house. He and his wife bought a little house and a little plot of land in the Rift Valley. And they put all their retirement. And the land is so important because that's what goes on. That's what you give to your children. And that's how your children are able to prosper. They had the land, and they knew when they died, their children would have that land. And then after the election, this warring tribe came through, and they burned their house to the ground. And he said that they lived in the forest in holes for 3 years until they were discovered by, and this is a typical story, they were discovered by the government and put in these camps. And you've got children, this has been 20 years. It was, they were okay with that because this was temporary. This was going to be a few months until they could get, their land. So that's why they want their land back. Their land was taken from them, and they expect the, government to give them back their land, and they're working on it. And they've been working on it because every time there's an election, then they start back from square one. And then new people come in. And you've got kids who grew up there who've never known anything else. They've never been outside of this camp. They've got a school there. There's no way, and they don't even know. You'll see a picture of one young man. His parents told him nothing. This is just where they live. You didn't know that they're in a IDP camp. This is where they live. This is home.
Let me quote the former Vice President of the Republic. I bet you that the reason half of us are in this country right now is that this is exactly what happens in the Highlands of Scotland.
Uh-huh.
And it's the basic route of the 15 and the 45.
That's my heritage. Yeah.
Mine too. But the half of my Calvinist house, the ones that were really mad enough to get out, had the land taken from you. And there was a time you didn't use the word Cumberland inside the Presbyterian on Catholic.
But of course they were sent to Ireland, and they wreaked havoc on the Catholics. So they did to others what were done to them. So yeah, it's no different. So the little children, you see on the left here, these preschoolers, just glommed on you. This happened at the orphanage as well as here. They just run to you and say, "Auntie, auntie, auntie," and they hold on. And we were invited into their. Each one, you got about 6 or 7 homes right there, and we got invited into these homes and these huts, and the children just waited outside very patiently. We came out, they were there, and they grabbed our hands again. It was funny because they tried to wipe the white off her. Because when their hands get burned, when something bad happens to their skin, it turns white. So they were very concerned. And watches were very like, what in the world? These numbers. So it was kind of funny. And so let's see. This is Rachel, and she was taking care of her grandson there. I think she's about 40 years old, but she looks like really much older. And grandson is nice and chubby, and his father was out chopping wood, so she takes care of him all day. And they were happy to talk to us. They really were. And so we brought our interpreters with us. And my interpreter was, you'll see a picture of him, is Moses. And he is not only a pastor in the community, he's also a pastor at this IDP camp. He knows his people. He knows all of them. And so when we were talking, and he, you say a sentence or two, and he'd say about 8 sentences, and you knew that he was talking about, But I figured, hey, he knows these people. That's fine with me, because, Ben said, oh, you got to tell your interpreter to stick to this, what you're saying. I'm thinking, I don't think so. I think, he's building these bridges. He's got this rapport. I think we're a good team. So I didn't try to rein him in. Ben says, rein him in. It's working out all right. Elena on the right, left here, she's got bubbles, so the kids love that. Merle over there, he's got puppets, and the kids, you bring out some toys, you bring out. We've had little stuffed dogs that when we went into the homes and there were children there, we would give them these little stuffed animals, and they just, really just swarmed around the bubbles and the puppets. They were a little scared. The tiny ones were a little scared of some of those puppets. You break one out and they go, You never saw such a thing. Yeah, Moses is on the left there. And that's Reuben. I don't know if you can see Reuben's face there. That was kind of one of his first times at the IDP camp. And this was toward the end of our day. And he, when these interpreters are hearing this people's stories and reporting them back to us, he was deeply affected. Hearing, story after story after story about loss and trauma. There was, we heard a lot about abuse in the camp, alcoholism in the camp, divorce, things that happened to them before getting there. Things are, going on with the children. So you can almost see in his face that he's a little shell-shocked. And here's just a group of the kids were just, their noses were constantly dripping. They were just kind of, and like the conditions inside this is like inside the home. It's just these plastic, like garbage bag sheets, covered with soot, a 3-stone fire in the middle of the room, constantly giving off smoke. You got to sit in a way that you're not just in the line of the smoke, or you'll just start tearing up immediately. And that's another woman with a grandson, and you can't really. There's another woman with a baby there. You can't see her too well. She called that. She's got one son's child, and this woman, Teresa over here, is her other son's woman. In other words, they're not married, but she has this child, and there's just a lot of these kind of casual relationships that exist in a community in the camp.
How is the camp governed? Is it tribal elders or other police?
There's different sections. Now, he was that person that Ben was with. He was the main overseer, but then it's broken up into some tribal units, and they have a tribal council. There's a leadership structure. There's a government structure. And Moses seemed to know about it, and he wasn't the only pastor. There are other pastors, so it's a real city. So they make up their own rules and govern and legislation. Yeah, they have a form of government. Now, the two young women on either side of the boy, they're members of our team, Sarah and Elena. He was an older boy. He was 13. He was like home during the day, not at school, because some incident with a soccer ball that couldn't quite make out. That he was in trouble and he was suspended for the day, and they were sorting that out. And, I guess he didn't have a lot, we asked if we could come in, and he said yes, and there were like 3 or 4 of us and him, and he was very nice about talking to us. And again, we asked him what he wanted to do when he grew up, and he wants to be a pilot. He wants to fly. He wants to be a pilot. We heard that from a lot of young people. They want to be pilots, which I think says a lot about them just wanting to fly away. But we asked, why do you think, what did your parents tell you about why you were living here? And he says, nothing. He didn't know that he was living anywhere different than anybody else. So, that's just life. But he's never been outside of this camp. Uh-huh.
Is it homogeneous as far as religious?
Yeah.
Or is there Muslim and Christian within the same group camp?
No, I think from what I could tell from Moses, everybody it was only Christians was the only religion being practiced there. I don't think, Kenya does have a Muslim population for sure, but didn't seem to be there. And it's amazing, in talking to people's deep trauma, they also talked about their deep faith. And that's what, we asked them, what do you do to cope? Oh, we talk to one another. We talk about the government, we have our, committees or whatever. But especially the women, they found one another to talk to. They prayed a lot, and they really, their faith was very, very meaningful to them. That was their rock.
Is the Muslims in power, or
no.
The Christians in power? The government is...
The government is parliamentary.
But it's not broken down by religious...
I don't think so. No. And there's not a separation of church and state, obviously. They're very free to practice their faith in these secular contexts. So I was there 2 weeks. I really don't know a lot about the political structure, but I'm sure it's changing like every other country, but right now it seems like it's a real Christian majority. Uh-huh.
When you're counseling someone who's been traumatized, what do you say to them? How do you counsel them?
Well, a lot of times they just never have they don't really tell their story. Just asking them to tell their story and being a listening ear, finding out from them ways that they cope, encouraging, because you're not going to tell them how to cope so much because you're only there for 10, 20 minutes. So, getting them to, talk with you about, what their needs are, how do you meet those needs, what can you do, helping them think through their situation. We prayed with them sometimes with the help of Moses. There are some techniques like deep breathing and visualization, hope. Really talking about hope and optimism to the extent that was realistic, and asking them about other teams had come, other people had come as well. So I think just letting them know they were not forgotten, and that we were counseled by our leaders to make very sure not to make promises to them, like, okay, we'll talk to the government, we'll write letters, or give them money. Some of the older children after school were definitely looking for handouts and money, and we just said, I'm sorry, we don't have any, not to give them promises that we couldn't keep.
Say something about the stones technique.
I will. Yeah, we didn't do that here, but. Okay, the next day we went to, oh my gosh. We're late. I'll just run through these. These schools, we went to a secondary school. Here's our little team, Elena, me, and Sarah. We gave a talk on conflict resolution 3 times. This is that heading is wrong. They're 9th graders. They had to this was an empty building. They had to take their desks, there were 2 people to a desk, and walk it across campus to this auditorium. and sit, and we did role play. We had fun with them. We did a lot of role plays with conflict, what good listening was, what bad listening was. They really enjoyed that. I was a really bad listener. And so then we and this was an older group. That was 9th, these are like 11th, and so there are 3 groups that we talked to, and all before lunch. And the headmistress was she came after we gave our talk, she's the one sitting on to the right there. She just came up very sternly and told these students, now, the best gift, the best thank you can give these people is to, when you have a conflict with your family or with a friend, or when you grow up and you're voting to resolve things, with these techniques that you're being taught, not violently. And these teachers are being very intentional about teaching good conflict resolution skills to these high school students so that this violence will not continue to the next generation. And these students are going home and talking to their parents about these things. And it's hard for the fathers to listen to their sons and daughters and be lectured to them, but they're making an impact. And it's funny because you can see we have our translator, he's sitting next to me, so because she was also very adamant, you're only going to speak English, so why do we need a translator? Because from time to time, these students would laugh when we would say something and it wasn't that funny. And the interpreter would kind of chuckle, and they didn't understand our English words sounded like something else. And so our English and their English often didn't communicate, so he had to translate our English into their English. So I'm just going to go really fast. I'm sorry about that. That's the Rift Valley. On our way up and back from town, we would pass through there, the little gift shops. We did the National City Park in Nairobi is hundreds and hundreds of acres, where they have these animals, and it's got an open door to the Rift Valley where these animals can go to the big game park. So it's a pretty open, it's a huge area for them, and so they've got them contained from the big city, from Nairobi, but they can wander from here into the game park. And the idea was on Friday that part of working with trauma is that you've got to take care of yourself. And so you need one day out of 7 to relax. And that's, to get, to do recreation. And that's what part of our training is, and that's what we experienced ourselves. And that's a Maasai market in Nairobi. And we get ripped off royally. Yeah. I think I supported a family for a month. A little. Okay, and we had that was a Friday. This is Saturday. A community conference. People from the community came, about 70 people, and again talked on sex trafficking, and that's a huge problem. I'll just kind of relate. These, because of the poverty, these very well trained individuals come into town, and they tell parents that that their daughters can be au pairs in the big city, or they can get them a wonderful job in Dubai or Saudi Arabia, and they can send money home, and they'll never, and the church rejoices. Oh, look, you're so lucky, and they can support our church, and the pastors are kind of in on it, and they, and so, but then people say, oh no, a neighbor might say, oh no, you shouldn't do this because this will be bad for your daughter. Oh no, this is different. These guys are different. We believe, we trust these people, and so when we had group discussion. Everybody in the group knew somebody who this had happened to. Church on Sunday, these little children, they would get up there and they say, praise the Lord again, I love Jesus, and then they would say their memory verse, one after, from the little ones to the big ones. They'd sing, and it was one big singing and dancing, just went on for a couple hours. Nothing, I've never experienced anything so joyful. This is a little girl. I was really interested in learning how to help people tell their stories of trauma using found objects, using stones, and people opened up. And this is a little girl, cross-culturally. She was talking about, in terms of human trafficking, when she was little, and these people brought, I guess she was in that slum, Kibera, and thieves broke in. She ran to her grandfather's house, and grandfather is just a name for an older man. And then they took her friend Ben, and she was telling the story about taking Ben, and we never saw Ben again. And then she ended up here, so what happened to her parents? I don't know. But she was, she very carefully sorted the dark stones and the light stones and hid people, and she was just talking about how several times her family was, she had to flee from these robbers, whom I'm thinking they were probably your traditional robbers, but they might have been these, she was hidden in the house, so these traffickers couldn't get to her. So she's been in there since she was 5 years old. But she was, I talked to her off and on, and but just in very short order, she got very deep into the story. We got permission. And I presented this whole thing on stones to my Christian Psychological Association. And we also did it we taught the pastors. We taught them how to use stones when talking to people in their community. But so in order to teach them, we asked them to just say something about their own lives as an example. They got so much, because they got really into their own stories. And we're finding out that the caregivers, 80% of them have had horrible loss. So these pastors have seen people die in front of them, have lost people to the violence, and they've never shared it. So they started talking, we were with them for 2 weeks, and after doing this for a few minutes, they started really, things that they shared with us that would not have shared otherwise. We had a pastors' conference for 2 days, and we brought two big boxes of books and shared to these pastors, and they had a lot of worship. And here's just the training, and that little tent in the back. That's where I did my groups. About 60 pastors came. We had a women's conference the next day. That's my group right there. That's lining up for lunch. Then we had a men's conference, and we talked a lot about domestic violence and ways to handle that other than violence. And we also talked about child raising in terms of, and we thought, what can we tell them about child raising? Well, both in the schools and in the community, corporal punishment is very, spanking, hitting children, that's how they keep them in line. And so how to use natural consequences as a way, helping children learn through discipline rather than just hitting them. And they really enjoy talking about it. Both men and women wanted to talk about that. Women were less willing to talk about domestic violence because they just accepted that this is the way it was. Fortunately, the men were more open to talking about it, and that's who you really want to influence. And it was the older men in the groups talking to the younger men, because the older men didn't grow up. They grew up more with the traditional tribal society, which was more respectful than when the colonial. So that kind of all broke down. The elder talking to the younger has broken down. Now maybe, the elders are finding more of a voice with the youngers. And they're saying, listen to your children, respect your wife. So hopefully that's changing.
We're just in a conversation I had with my 15-year-old. We had an interesting conversation at lunch recently of corporal punishment. And I just thought it was really interesting. He said, Mom, it's just amazing how many parents, beat their kids. And I said, so, do you think they really beat them, or are they just saying because they spank them? And he said, no, one was burned, and one was, and it was just, and I asked him what nationality were some of these kids, and it was just, one was Indian, one was Hispanic, some African Americans. It was kind of a mix.
Acceptable.
So it was very interesting within our own school systems. That
we had in the schools have them write down writing on little pieces of paper and looking at it. And we saw a lot of that, and they use the word beats sometimes, and they really meant had a conflict with some. You're not quite sure how they're using the word. There's our team at the end with the interpreters. The last day we went to this bead factory that was set up during the colonial times, but it's for single women, single mothers, to make a living. They do a lot of exporting all over the world. They're doing a wonderful business and employing a lot of women and some men. And they've got good working policies about living wage and all of that. We went to, maybe you saw a PBS special on the David Sheldrick wildlife. This is our other orphanage we visited. This is on our way out. And they just take care of these elephants who have been, their mothers have been poached and they've been abandoned. And they raise them for a couple of years until they're ready to be reintroduced to a herd that they find, and it takes about 5 years for them to acclimate into a herd. So it's a huge project, raising these little ones until they're able to go back. And these the caregivers were extremely knowledgeable. You can see this one is drinking his own bottle. So we saw the little ones through the ones that were almost able to be reintroduced. And then the last couple of days we were in Dubai on the way back, and just spent a couple of days again R&R, and that's that big tall building, the Burj Khalifa. This is the women's side of the mosque. You see all the women's shoes, and that's a beautiful mosque in Dubai. You can see it's all about the architecture. They do fabulous things with buildings. It looks very hazy because it is, but it's not pollution, it's sand. It's just the sand particles. We were there during Ramadan, so we were told you can't even, this was like about 100 degrees, you can't even drink water on the street. You have to be in the van with the windows shut, with the curtain shut, if you want to eat or drink anything. And that was also the couple days where the American embassy was closed down in these Arab countries because of the terrorist threat, and that's a spice soup for the old part of town. So, got done by 10:30. Thank you again for your prayers.